Welcome back to Howling Around. Today, I want to talk about something really simple, but something very overlooked, and that is what should you actually get out of a date? What's the whole point of going? What should you expect? And, what's the bare minimum that makes a date worth your time? And a lot of guys, but also women, go into dates either expecting way too much or expecting nothing at all. And both extremes make dating feel exhausting. I've been there. And that is because if you go thinking, this might be the one, you're putting way too much pressure on yourself and the situation, aka the date, and you're also putting a lot of pressure on her. But she doesn't know that, and that's not fair. And if you go in thinking, yeah, whatever, I'll just see what happens, then you're not treating the date seriously enough to actually build, any real connection. You don't give it a fair try. So let's bring it back to the core. Let's bring it back to the basics. What is a date actually for? Well, at its simplest, a date is just two people sitting down to see if they enjoy each other's presence, each other's company. And that's it. Nothing more, nothing less. It's not about figuring out if she's your future wife, if she's perfect, if she ticks every box, if she wants kids, if she wants to marry, if she has the same hobbies. It's none of those things. Now, I'm not saying those things are not important, but that's not what the date is for. The date is really just, checking whether you feel good spending time with her for let's say an hour, maybe two or longer if the date is really going well. You're just checking if the vibe works, if it feels good. You're checking if you can just talk naturally, just being yourself, you know, without forcing anything. And the bare minimum you should get out of a date is actually really, really simple. At least for me, it is. And I want, well, really two things. One, I want someone who shows up because I need someone to show up to actually have a date. So that would be, a important thing. Someone who shows up. And the second part would be if she shows up, a somewhat enjoyable conversation. Now, enjoyable is relative, but something that I can say, yeah, I kind of like that. And that's it. If she arrives and if she's present and the conversation has somewhat of a flow to it, then yeah, that's already a good date, right? I mean, I can hear you think like, man, but I want I want to have a kiss on the first date, I want to get her number, or I want to set up a second date or blah blah blah. But remember that's not what the date is for. It really is about showing up, having somewhat of a good conversation, and a vibe check. That's really what the date is. You really have to remember that that is what it is. A date doesn't need fireworks. You don't need a kiss. You don't necessarily need to set up a second date. I've had plenty of, good first dates, and a lot of them never, turned into a second date. It didn't mean that the first date wasn't, a good first date. Not every date ends with a kiss. Some of them do, but definitely not all of them. Some of them end in, bedroom fun, but not all of them. Doesn't mean if, those things do not happen that the date is not a good date. You really have to set the bar a little bit lower. Just say, I want someone who shows up. I want somebody that, actually can hold a fun or enjoyable conversation. And that's it. You don't need the fireworks. You don't need the insane chemistry, which, you can create if you know what you're doing. And you don't need some magical moment, which is something you can create as well if you know what you're doing. I'll talk about that later. A first date is successful, I think, if you can walk away thinking, yeah, that was nice. I'd like to talk to her again. Or when you're sitting in your car and you think, well, I don't want to see her again, but at least we had a good conversation. She made me laugh a few times and she was easy to talk to. And I have some experience that I can take into another date. You know, that you can say, well, this night or this hour wasn't a complete waste of time. And honestly, most good dates are exactly that. They're just pleasant and calm. They're definitely not perfect or life changing. They are you know, just nice. That's it. And a lot of guys sabotage themselves by chasing a level of connection that simply doesn't happen on date one. I mean, if you know what you're doing, and I will talk about this in upcoming episodes. If you know what you're doing, you can create that connection faster, that chemistry, and those magical moments. But simply put, on a first date, that doesn't just happen. You're strangers. You don't know each other yet. And the most realistic goal is just to see if you can talk comfortably and, check out if the energy feels right, And what does a good date actually look like? Well, the conversation should go both ways. She doesn't just talk about herself, but she also asks you things. You don't feel like you're carrying the whole interaction. You're not pretending to be somebody that you're not. You're not performing. You're not walking on eggshells. It just feels natural. She smiles, you smile. Maybe she laughs, you laugh. She makes some eye contact, which is important, and you do the same. And, she's present, in the date, in the conversation. You don't need deep emotional moments. You just need natural flow where you think, yeah, this feels nice. I like this. That's all you need. You know, one of the most important things you should ask yourself after a date is not, does she like me? Well, that is important, but really you should step away from that and just, don't care about it. What you want to ask yourself is, do I like her? Do I want to see her again? You gotta flip it. Because guys flip that question and they chase women who like them instead of, chasing a woman that they actually like. So, if you walk away feeling calm and comfortable and genuinely open to another date, that's usually a good sign, right? So, bottom line is this: a date doesn't need to be perfect, a date doesn't need sparks flying, it just needs to be pleasant. And, when I say sparks flying, I've been on many dates and I've had, text messages after a date where the woman just says, "Well, I didn't feel the sparks flying." And I'm thinking, "Yeah, me neither, but I had a good time." But you need sparks and chemistry and all that. That's not really necessarily how it works. So we need something pleasant, we need a good conversation and a nice vibe. And, someone who shows up, of course, and shows up fully, and somebody who meets you halfway. If you get that, then seeing her again makes sense. And if it doesn't, then don't force it. You're not trying to build a relationship on top of nothing. At the end of the day, dating is supposed to feel like two people exploring each other's company, not two people auditioning or trying to survive awkward silence. If you leave the date feeling calm and comfortable and, a little curious, I would say that's a win. That's what should be, you know, that's what you should be getting out of it. So that's it. That's all you need from a date. It's very simple. Someone who shows up and, enjoyable conversation, I think. So that's it. Hope this was helpful for you. And thanks for listening. And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye bye.